Nice. All right, well, it's now 8:01, so let's go ahead and get the party started here. My name is David, and I am a Spanish and ESL teacher here in Denver, Colorado. I made it my goal a little earlier this year to, very modest goal, just to make Denver the most bilingual city in the United States. So this is, as I've been trying to do that, I've been increasingly working with more and more teachers and talking to other people in this industry. And it seems like there's a need for my idea of what we're going to do here today, which is collectively with other world languages teachers, research theories, and try to come together to create some best practices for world languages teachers. Today's webinar is primarily geared for the world language teacher that is curious about teaching conversation classes in their classes, right? So I'm going to try and teach you how just about anyone can get started teaching a conversational world language class, which is what I've been doing full-time for the past 11 years or so now. The idea is I just want to collaborate more with other teachers, right? Let's come together and collaborate more on theory, research, and practice, because you know, it sounds like you know, a lot of the theory and stuff gets created in higher education, but then we're the real world teachers that are actually in classrooms teaching, and there's a big disconnection from a lot of what's going on, right? A lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today are things that I've only recently become familiar with, and I think it's a shame. I think everybody that's in the field of teaching should be more familiar with some of this stuff that we're going to discuss today. So the highlights of today's webinar are going to be about why you should consider starting a world language conversation class. We'll talk about who you will teach and where you can teach. Because it's a really small group, I think it would be just fine if we make this totally interactive today. So normally I would say leave your comments in the chat. If you want to leave comments in the chat, that's fine, but feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions or comment on what we're talking about, because the purpose of this is really to start a conversation with other teachers and collaborate. I want to hear your ideas. I'm not necessarily an expert per se on what we're going to talk about, so there may be some other people that are more familiar with some of this stuff, and we're just all here to kind of learn together. So before we jump into this, what about this webinar called your attention? Does anybody have a preference to focus on topics 1, 2, or 3 here, or doubts about that? Or is
okay,
it...
I'll say something. I think that conversational Spanish has been really the missing everything. I know I learned Spanish, probably some other people here learned Spanish in middle school, high school, college, but there wasn't a focus on conversational. And what happens when you do that is when you finally get to talk to people, because of course we came up where there was no internet. So we kind of just learned the Spanish in a book, which is a conglomeration of 21 countries Spanish, right? So when I finally began meeting people because of the internet, I was saying words like mi propósito or mi meta when I switched it. And my friends were like, I have no idea what that is. I don't know what that is. Well, how would you say it? They said, I don't know, because I don't know what you're trying to say. So I had to look for mi intento. I had to look for, how do I say my goal or the purpose of this, or, you know, how do I say that? But I heard that every day of my life. So what I'm saying is, I think that conversation is most important, because if you learn from the book traditionally, you can almost handicap because you know all the Spanish, but a lot of times people aren't going to understand what you're saying.
Yeah, well, the scenario you're describing too is even a little bit different than you know, grammar-based Spanish versus conversational Spanish. I think you're really describing more of a level of formality, because propósito and meta should be understood, but oftentimes what some of what we encounter, right, is when we're learning Spanish in school, we're studying the very formal Castilian Spanish coming from Spain. But here in the United States, we're interacting with speakers from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, that speak a slightly different Spanish that might not be quite so formal. And I've definitely encountered that too, where when I'm teaching English classes, students say, no, that's not the way you say that word, right? Like they have their different vocabulary or their different terminology, which is incredibly important. And so, yeah, I had a similar frustration, after having studied Spanish for several years, feeling like I was starting to get the hang of it, and then traveling abroad and getting exposed to a completely different form of Spanish. So good. Some of the theories that I have incorporated in this talk today include the second language acquisition theory from Stephen Krashen, Barriers to Innovation by Bill VanPatten, Anyone Can Speak a New Language in 6 Months by Chris Lunsdale, and then Speaking a Language is Instinctual from Stephen Pinkerton. So first, from everybody that's here, tell me a little bit about who you are. I'm a current teacher, but I am definitely what's called a teacherpreneur, combining entrepreneurship with teaching. I started my own world language school here in Denver. It's a private school where I teach adults. And the reason why I did that was because what I found at the time for teaching opportunities here in Denver were primarily based on grammar-based instruction, which from my own personal experiences of having been a Spanish student, which went through a formal both high school and college program that was primarily grammar-based, and then living in South America and going through more conversation classes, I definitely felt the conversation classes were much more powerful, and that's what I wanted to do. But there weren't any options to do that here in Denver back in 2011, so that's why I went the way that I did. You can put this in the chat or feel free to chime in, but are you a current teacher, a prospective teacher, or a teacherpreneur? This is an interactive presentation, so please chip in on the conversation.
I can answer. Yeah, I can answer, but I wanted to give other people an opportunity to answer. That's why I'm quiet. Wait.
Okay.
Well, I can't hear anything.
If anybody wants to put it in the chat, please do. I'm going to go ahead and move on since nobody's responding here. Well, my first point is, why start a conversational program, right? I don't know if you're teaching Spanish, English, French, Italian, Japanese, regardless of whatever language you're teaching, I can just about guarantee that it's what your students want. Your students want to learn how to speak the language, right? Conversation is fun. Conversation classes are a lot of fun. They're a lot more practical, and it's also a human instinct to learn how to communicate verbally. So let's talk about each one of these. I don't know what your experiences are, but never have I once met somebody that said, I want to learn Spanish so I can fill out a multiple choice test and get a passing grade, right?
That's correct. Yes, that is 100% true.
Yeah. But what do we as teachers do? We give our students multiple choice tests.
I know, it's just easier, but no, not easier. Yeah.
Everybody, I would say easily 80%, 90%, maybe 95% or more of language students, when they decide, hey, I want to learn how to speak Spanish, right? Nobody says, I want to learn how to do a written test in Spanish. I believe there are people that say, I would love to learn how to read in Spanish. So that's why I say it's not maybe 100%, because I think literature is a fascinating subject in of its own. But in my experience, people want to learn how to speak the language. They don't want to learn the grammar rules. They don't want to learn how to write the language, at least initially. Initially, their primary focus is on speaking the Spanish. So why should you start a conversation program? It's what your students want. And I think as teachers, a lot of teachers kind of miss that point, right? It's not what the teacher wants, it's what the student wants. Of course, it depends on the particular type of program that you're in, but we should do a lot more to cater classes to what our students want, right? To keep our students engaged. By show of hands, who is familiar with Professor Bill VanPatten? So Bill VanPatten is a legend in this space, not only in the, I know he was a big time Spanish instructor. I think he taught French too. But he was also what we call a second language acquisition expert, right? So a little bit different than a language instructor, but someone that's also focused on exactly what happens in the brain as people are learning a new language. So we're going to watch this little presentation that he did, just a little clip from it. So give me 1 second to pull this up. I'm going to share my screen with you. So we're just going to watch a few seconds of this. Can everybody see the YouTube video here? Yeah. Okay.
No.
I spearheaded the committee one time when I first got back to Michigan State to try to change the undergraduate major. I was asked to do this. And so we had this large committee of 6 people, and we were really drafted, we were headed to this idea of, why does a major have to have requirements? Why not just have an open major and let students select courses? And if you want to do all literature, do all literature. If you want to do all culture, do all culture. If you want to do a mix, do all mix. If you want to do linguistics, if you want whatever. And also start to offer courses that are language related in the sense of helping improve proficiency. And let students select what they want to do. And the reason I was pushing this was because as I did an analysis of the students, I did a population survey. 70% of our students were not regular Spanish majors. They were majors in microbiology, business, chemistry, and they were there because they wanted to learn Spanish. This is what they told me in surveys. Only about 30% were the traditional Spanish major where they wanted to do something with Spanish. But even when I started surveying them, there was a question about how many plan on going on with Spanish after they graduate. 5%. 5%. That's important, 5%. Because when we finally went to the table with this proposal to start to change the major, the pushback from some colleagues was, but how does this prepare them for graduate school? And my response was, well, none of them are going to graduate school in Spanish.
Okay, so were you able to hear that okay? I never know how a video like that is going to come across the internet on the other end, but Bill VanPatten was talking in this presentation about some of the frustrations that he had when it came to trying to shift the dynamic from grammar-based instruction to, whether it be CI or conversation classes. And in this very brief clip, he describes that this notion of the top-down program creation, where at the highest level of academia, grad school, that was essentially dictating how most of these programs were going. But he found that, so he did a survey of both teachers and students, right? And he found that most teachers at the college level are teaching Spanish majors based on the requirements of what grad schools are looking for them to get into grad school. But at the same time, he found only 5% of students were actually planning on going to grad school. Okay, and 70% of the people that were in the Spanish programs were looking to learn Spanish to do nothing with going to grad school or teaching Spanish at some point, but rather to learn how to speak the language for doing business or going into like a medical practice or something like that. Robin, did I see your hand up? No? Okay. So think about that, right? All of the teachers want to prepare students for grad school. Less than 5% of the students are planning on going to grad school. So there's a big disconnection in what students want and what teachers want, right? So these are some of the challenges I think that we need to address as language teachers. Another big thing that I've been studying up on lately is principles in second language acquisition. So I think the all-star in this area is a guy named Stephen Krashen. So if you're not familiar with Krashen, this book is definitely worth reading. But in this book, he describes part of his theory on second language acquisition is the affective filter. And I think this is probably one of the most important things that we should do a better job of as teachers. And yet I think very few teachers are taking this into consideration. I didn't even know what this was called until a couple of years ago, right? But the affective filter talks about three things. Students that learn how to speak a new language are motivated, they have a good level of self-confidence, and they have low anxiety. So let's talk about that a little bit. So point one is motivation. Performers with high motivation generally do better in second language acquisition. What does this tell me? As a language instructor, I need to do everything in my power to motivate my students. I'm curious from the teachers that are here, what are you doing to motivate your students? Does anybody have anything they can share on trying to motivate students to take the language learning seriously and start speaking it? No? Okay, well, let's move on. If anybody wants to comment on that, let me know. The second point here is the self-confidence. So performers with self-confidence and a good self-image tend to do better in second language acquisition. Confidence is a huge word of mine. I firmly believe that it is my job as an instructor to build up my students' confidence in the new language and to try to do so as quickly as possible. Does anybody have anything that they can add to the conversation about self-confidence with your students? So I try to just be, heavy in my praise of students, right? I try to get them speaking from day number one. And, every time they say something, I really tried to do a big job of congratulating them, saying that their pronunciation was really good, try and go really above and beyond to get them speaking the language and making them feel good about it. Because it's a very uncomfortable situation to speak a new language, especially the older you are, right? The younger you are, for preschool kids and kindergarten and very, very elementary school, they tend to just pick things up, right? They're like little sponges, but the older you are, high school, college, adults become very self-conscious when it comes to speaking a new language. They're very hesitant to make mistakes in front of their peers. So I think we have to go above and beyond to try and build up our students' confidence. Finally, anxiety, right? The affective filter says that low anxiety appears to be conducive to second language acquisition. And I can talk about that all day, right? For my own personal experiences, I remember living in South America when I was learning how to speak Spanish and having really good days where I felt like I was very conversational. I was able to talk to everybody. I was able to understand things. And then just because, the way people are, sometimes you have a bad day. You wake up in a bad mood, or you're late, you're rushed, you're angry about something. And I remember having moments like that where, your brain, you just freeze up, you get nervous, you all of a sudden just come to a blank mental state and you can't even think of what you want to say in your native language or in your new language, right? So this, definitely has an impact on people. We're going to watch another video here, just a little brief clip from Chris Lunsdale, who gives a presentation. It's actually a TED Talk on how anyone can learn how to speak a new language in 6 months. I was really skeptical at first when I saw this presentation. Somebody forwarded this to me and said, "Oh, get a load of this guy. Like, this is impossible," right? Because it took me a long time to learn how to speak Spanish. It took intensive studies for years and years and years before I felt like I could speak it confidently. But I watched the presentation with an open mind and I learned a lot from it. And I started thinking about that and employing these principles into my classes, and they work beautifully. So his principle number 5 is psychophysiological state matters. So let's go back to YouTube for this.
And the final principle is state, psychophysiological state. If you're sad, angry, worried, upset, you're not going to learn, period. If you're happy, relaxed, in an alpha brain state, curious, you're going to learn really quickly. And very specifically, you need to be tolerant of ambiguity.
All right, so who can relate to what he just said there? Does anybody here have any personal experiences of getting that kind of mental blockage or being in a bad mood? Or have you noticed that with your students, where you have students that seem to sometimes be able to just pick everything up you're saying and start using it right away, and then they come to class one day and like they have no idea what you're talking about and are unable to participate? I've noticed that in my classes, you know, and it has to do with that mental state of mind. So keep in mind, you know, the affective filter, right? Motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety play a huge role in the language learning process. The last point I want to make about why you should teach conversation classes is that according to Steven Pinker, who is not a language teacher, but he's a linguist, which is really focused just all around on how people learn languages and the, you know, the mental state, what's going on in the brain throughout first language acquisition, second language acquisition, what happens with brain injuries and why people sometimes lose the ability to speak in a new language. But in this book, The Language Instinct, he talks about learning how to speak a language is instinctual, right? Little kids are not taught how to speak their first language. Little kid, you know, not once in the world has a parent picked up in the United States an English grammar book and sat down with their baby and started providing English classes, right? So his argument here is that it's an instinct. We are pre-wired. The human brain is pre-wired to start to understand a language and then start to speak it, right? It's a phenomenon that nobody is ever taught their first language. And as a second language instructor, I think that has huge consequences on the way that we should teach our students how to speak their new language. And we should pay a lot more attention to the way that people learn their first language and try to apply it when and where possible when learning a second language. Now, adults were pre-wired with we already have inside of us a language, a language system of communication, right? So you can't exactly teach adults the same way that kids learn their first language. However, I think there's a lot of lessons we can take from the first language acquisition process and apply it to second language acquisition. And it all gets back to conversation, right? Little kids learn how to speak their first language by speaking it. First, by listening to their parents, they get to a point where they can start to understand their parents. And then at some point they start trying to imitate or repeat the words that they're hearing. They typically start with what? With one word. They latch onto that word. They start speaking it. Sometimes we have to correct them. Then they eventually get the hang of a couple of more words. Then they start forming sentences. And next thing you know, they're talking, right? And creating a more natural language learning process for our students, I think is really powerful stuff. The last one here is conversation classes are more practical. I just came across this article a couple of weeks ago, and I just found it very, very interesting. Has anybody seen this? So I frequently, when I'm in my classes with my students, you know, and I'm stressing the importance of learning how to speak the language. For years, I've been giving this example. I mean, what are you going to do with learning how to read or write the new language? You know, you're not going to go into a bank and pass the teller a note to take out your money, right? Like that could get you into some trouble. Sure enough, that happened with the director of that movie, Black Panther, Ryan Coogler. I think this was in Atlanta. He did just that. So when you read into it and hear his side of the story, he apparently takes out a very large amount of money at a time. And so he didn't want the other customers or the patrons to hear how much money he was withdrawing. So he thought that he would write it on a note and pass the note to the bank teller. At which point, when the bank teller got the note, she hit the silent alarm and called the police, and the police came in, arrested him, took him out in handcuffs. And so, yeah, speaking the language is a little bit more practical than reading and writing it. Not to say that reading and writing it is not important, because obviously reading and writing it is important. But if we go back to what Pinker was thinking with language being instinctual, how do kids learn their first language? They start by learning how to understand a language. Then they start learning how to produce words. Then they start learning how to communicate in full sentences, right? And they do this up until about the time that they go to kindergarten, which at that point, if they've been speaking the language for like 2 to 3 years, then they start learning how to read the language, right? And then they start learning how to write the language. And then much later, by 4th grade, 5th grade, something like that, middle school for sure, they start studying the grammar rules. You know, what makes the language work the way that it does. So if you think about it, we learn our first language and we're effectively using it to communicate with people for about 9 to 10 years before we start learning grammar, right? We certainly learn how to speak it before we learn how to read it and write it. But from my experience, from being a high school and a college student, my teacher's goals were to get me to learn the grammar and how to read and write the language. And they practically gave no attention to learning how to speak the language. All right. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far? Okay, so we're going to go into this next part. Who will you teach conversation classes? And I'll just tell you a little bit about my experience, right? So I specifically work with adults and I teach them conversational Spanish and English here in Northeast Denver. Now, I cater to a very specific type of student. Working in a private school, in a private situation the way I do, has allowed me to develop a program that is geared towards these people, right? So if we look at this, when I teach Spanish, I'm working with Americans. When I teach English, I'm working with Mexicans and Central Americans. And I'll just say that this is in at least 80% of the situations. There's obviously some outliers of people coming from other backgrounds, but I think it's important to develop a deep understanding of the nationality of your students, right? On the Spanish side of things, my students are all college educated. And on the English side, they are not. My Spanish students tend to be 25 to 50 years old. My English students tend to be anywhere from 20 to 60 years old. Most of my Spanish students went through a traditional grammar-based approach in either high school or college. And pretty much the same thing for my English students. In much of Latin America, they even start studying English like in kindergarten. And then also once they move here to the United States, it's very common to study English in nonprofit programs or free programs, which are heavy in abundance here in the Denver area. My Spanish students are learning Spanish so that they can talk to people at work or for travel. My English students are learning English again for work, but also because they're living here in English-speaking communities, so they need to be able to live their lives in English, right? And on both sides, despite their background with the languages and education and everything like that, most of my students end up having to start from zero. So we're going to talk about this, but for you, your takeaway here is if you're teaching people, you should always have a good student profile. You should understand who your students are. What's their nationality? What is their first language? What's their educational background? What's their experience with the language? How old they are, why they're learning, and what their current level of the language is. So feel free to take a little screenshot or jot this down as I'm going through this. I think you'd get a lot out of it if you start kind of filling out your student profile. So obviously you can only fill out a student profile if you're currently working with students. If you are a prospective teacher, if you're thinking about teaching, or if you're thinking about starting your own program, it's perhaps even more important that you have an idea of what types of students you want to work with. So as we'll see here, if we dive in a little deeper about my Spanish students, who are they? They're Americans. And why does that matter? Well, I can easily explain things that they don't understand in English. Americans, from a cultural perspective, come from a society, a culture that praises individuality over collectivity. And this matters a lot because when I'm doing activities in class, I can, students are much more comfortable working by themselves, right? Versus when I teach English to Spanish speakers, which is a collective society culturally, they like to do everything in groups. It's much more common for me to teach private classes in Spanish. My students often want to be the only student in class. And in English, very rarely do I get a student that wants to learn private one-on-one. They almost always want to learn with a group. I have no cultural barriers with my American students. There's a familiar classroom dynamic. The things that I expect to do in class is also what they expect to do in class. Versus people coming from Latin America, just the classroom dynamic is way different, right? So you have to understand that in order to be an effective teacher while you're teaching. Another interesting thing that I've found, especially since starting the pandemic, is that my American students have a very high level of competence with technology. When the pandemic first started, and I had to switch from doing classes in person and going online, pretty much all of my American students stuck with the program. They kept learning Spanish online. It was no big deal for them to go from in-person classes to Zoom classes. At the same time, about 95% of my English students stopped studying with me because they did not feel comfortable with the technology. So why does that matter? If you're thinking about teaching and you want to teach online, you need to have that understood, right? Finally, my American students tend to have a very low tolerance for ambiguity. Americans and English speakers tend to be extremely direct with what they say and what they expect to hear, whereas in the Latin cultures, they tend to be a lot more ambiguous, right? So all those things factor into my classes when I'm teaching. Next, my Spanish students are highly educated, right? They tend to be college educated, lots of them with master's degrees. And so the impact on me teaching classes is they have a pretty high level of tolerance for grammar. I actually started teaching Spanish full-time before I started teaching English. And I had a very good amount of success just using my old college textbooks. I still have my college textbooks from many years ago. I couldn't find a good program that was catered towards adults, so I just made use of what I had, and it went over pretty well. It was grammar-based, but working with my students live, I was able to mix in a lot of conversational activities, and they tend to just get it. Then I started teaching English here in Denver, and I essentially reverse engineered it, right? And I started essentially teaching a grammar-based English program, and it was terrible. I had terrible results. Most of my students dropped out after just a couple of weeks, right? And it's because they just weren't familiar with grammar at all, right? So you really have to take that into consideration with who you're working with. And over the years, I've gotten really good at breaking down the grammar into much more simplistic concepts and then teaching it conversationally, which my students appreciate, and then they stick there with me longer, right? Another thing about working with college educated students is that they already have good study habits. When you tell them to go home and do the homework and the book and to study, they know what you mean by that. With my English learners, they do not know what you mean when you say go home and study. You really have to show them live what studying looks like. And so my initial courses with my English students will move a lot slower because I spend a lot of time in class doing what the language learner should be doing at home, but I do that with them until they get comfortable with doing it so they know what to do. As I mentioned, my Spanish students are already familiar with Spanish. Most of them have already gone through a traditional grammar-based program in high school or college. Why does that matter to me as the language teacher? Well, most of them already recognize a lot of vocabulary. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on studying vocabulary initially, because most of my students know that mesa means table, or libro means book, or something like that. So that's less impactful on people that have already studied it at some point. Another thing I think is really fascinating for me and my students is that they already went through a grammar-based approach, which didn't work for them, didn't give them the results that they were looking for, so they're skeptical. They initially come into the program thinking, they're motivated because they need it for their work or for whatever situation they're going on a trip. So they're much more motivated than your typical high school student, perhaps. But they come in with that skepticism, right? Like, okay, this guy's saying he's going to teach me how to speak Spanish, but I already tried it, right? So I have to deliver. I have to give them results that they're looking for to make them happy, to boost up their confidence and motivate them. Age is another good thing you should take into consideration. I work with students that are 25 to 50 years old. So what does that mean to me? Well, adults face challenges that children don't, and they also have advantages that children don't. So if you're teaching children, then you have to create a program that focuses on that. I can tell you the challenges my adults have is that listening comprehension and pronunciation is a little challenging for them, right? The longer your ears have grown accustomed to hearing your first language, the harder it's going to be for you to start hearing and listening to a new language. Most people, when they first start a Spanish class, if you speak to them at speed, they have a very hard time recognizing where one word starts and stops, right? So, si yo quiero decir que hola, me llamo David, very fast like that, to them it just sounds like one very long word because their ear isn't accustomed to it. Regarding pronunciation, your face has many muscles in it. There's I think over 50 muscles in the face and the neck and the throat and the tongue and all that are being formed up until you're about 16 years old. So what that means is perfect pronunciation for an adult learner is not actually a realistic expectation. And I am aware of that. I learned Spanish as an adult. And while I think I have native-like proficiency, I understand everything, I can communicate in any type of situation, I still have an English accent when I speak Spanish with certain words, right? That doesn't mean I can't speak Spanish. Okay, I'm aware of my limitations. I'm an American. I should not expect to have a native Spanish accent, a native Mexican, or a native whatever accent, and nor do I demand my students. Now, where it could perhaps cause confusion, right? Like if you're trying to say nube, which means cloud, or nueve, which means 9, I have to be very strict about a pronunciation like that. But for the most part, just as long as they're speaking in a way that's understandable, I let it go, unless they're really asking for heavy pronunciation tips, right? My adults have very busy schedules, so I have to take that into consideration when asking them to practice and do homework outside of class. But probably the biggest thing when working with adults is they all have a choice about it. They don't have to study the language. And again, that tells me as the teacher is if I don't provide them with the best class as possible that's giving them results they will choose to stop studying with me, perhaps never studying Spanish again, or going to a different teacher or a different program. And then I stop getting paid because I have a private school. So I depend on what my students are paying me. So all those are things I have to take into consideration. You know, if you're working with kids, think about that backwards. Some of the other challenges, or rather the advantages that my adults have, is that they're highly motivated. You know, I hear it from high school teachers, middle school teachers all the time. The kids just don't want to learn the language, so they're not going to learn it. So I can't really, you know, it's not a realistic goal for me to teach them. You know, I don't have that problem. My students are paying a decent amount of money out of their own pockets to come and work with me. They're highly motivated. They know why. They have that real world experience, right? So like one of my students is a production manager for a manufacturing company here locally, where he's an American. His entire crew speaks Spanish, so he's learning Spanish to improve communication at work, to reduce, you know, I guess to improve productivity, to reduce mistakes, right? And to create a better work environment. So he's got a very strong reason and motivation for being there. I hear this all the time, right? You know, kids, you have to learn a language as a kid. You know, once you become an adult, you can't learn a new language. And I will bust that myth all day, every day. Adults actually have more cognitive capability than kids do. Kids have a more intuitive capabilities, and that's why kids tend to pick up languages easier than adults. But adults are 100% capable of learning how to speak a new language, and I can say that quite confidently because I've helped thousands of adults learn how to speak a new language because they have more cognitive capability. You just have to teach it a little bit differently, but it works. Another thing I love about working with adults is they tend to be pretty organized, right? So moving on, why do my students want to learn Spanish? They're learning it for either work or for travel. What does that mean for me, the teacher? I have to teach them what they want to learn. If I spend all day talking about going to the library, right? ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? It's not useful for them. So I have to teach them how to do customer service in Spanish. I have to teach them vocabulary related to construction, healthcare. I have to teach them, you know, how to talk to their employees, how to do management in Spanish. And there's a lot of cultural implications here as well that I have to teach. So it's not just the language, but I have to teach them the cultural way to manage somebody from a different country. From the travel side of things, I have to teach them how to order food at restaurants, how to buy souvenirs, how to, you know, make travel arrangements, book air flights and hotel reservations, checking into hotels. And they love it. They love it. I just had a student that got back from Costa Rica. She was only studying with me for 3 weeks before she went to Costa Rica. She started from zero, didn't know any Spanish at the beginning. And she told me that she felt comfortable communicating in about 30% of the situations that she was in, which might not sound like a whole lot, but I mean, to be comfortable communicating in 30% of your daily interactions with people after only 3 weeks of study is phenomenal. Next, most of my students are starting from the beginning. So despite having been exposed to the language at some point in their lives, they do not speak enough to be able to introduce themselves to a new person. So they have to start from the beginning. And this tells me everything I need to know, right? As a teacher, I have to put a heavy focus on new vocabulary. I have to use my first language, English, to teach Spanish and vice versa, so that I'm helping my students feel comfortable. So although I use English to explain Spanish, we then go into our activities where we speak Spanish. So a lot of world languages instructors tend to get really hung up on this, right? Like, oh no, you have to use the target language 100% of the time. If your students are brand new to the language, that does not go over very well, right? It does everything to take away their self-confidence. It demotivates them and it causes them great anxiety. So 100% immersion from day one is actually a really bad idea if you're taking into consideration that affective filter. I also try to simplify everything, right? I actually try to avoid grammar. If I have to teach something, some type of grammatical structure or something like that, I really break it down to the most simplest form possible so that my students can kind of take baby steps into it. And so what does that mean, right? One of the things I do that's way different from most teachers is when I teach verbs, I don't go and give the whole verb chart. In my experience, when I was in Spanish class, I learned an AR verb, an ER verb, and an IR verb from the very beginning from day number 1, and I had to learn all of the 6 conjugations, right? Yo, tú, él, ellos, usted, nosotros, vosotros, ellos, ellos, ellas, y ustedes, right? I had to learn all of that from day number 1, but it's not practical. So my approach to teaching verbs is I try to look at how they're used in a conversation, right? And what that essentially means is it's more practical just to start with tú y yo, because when you're speaking Spanish, you're going to ask a question in the tú form and you're going to answer it in the yo form. And that's going to cover you for most of your daily interaction. So if you're saying it's impossible, you taught that woman how to communicate in 30% of her daily interactions. The reason why it's possible is that all of her interactions were in the tú y yo form, right? If you think about going traveling someplace and walking in to buy something, you know, hola, necesito comprar una botella de agua. ¿Dónde está el agua, right? De dónde, you know, cuánto cuesta. Those are the types of things that you're needing to say. And then when you're meeting people, you know, it's all in the tú y the yo form, right? ¿De dónde eres? Ah, soy de los Estados Unidos. ¿Qué haces aquí en Costa Rica? Estoy de vacaciones. That's what you really need to start communicating. And so that's what I do in my classes, right? You don't have to teach everything all at once. You have to look for ways to simplify it, because that's going to build your students' confidence up. If you hit them with all the 6 verb conjugations from day number 1, it takes everything away from it. It takes away their motivation and their confidence and increases their anxiety. Another thing that I do in my classes is I spend a lot of time initially going over good study habits and how to practice the language, right? And from my experience of having started as a Spanish tutor at my college, I was working mostly with students that were failing their classes, right? And they were really worried they weren't going to graduate because of the requirement to pass a class. And I just noticed one thing very early on from the beginning is they didn't know how to study. When the teacher said, go home and study and then do the homework, what did they do? They went home, they opened up their books, and they started trying to answer the questions, right? They were not taking in to consideration that to learn the language, you have to start with the vocabulary and memorize the words. So the first thing I would always do with my students is teach them how to use flashcards to memorize Spanish. And just from doing that alone, they would almost instantly raise their grade up by a 2-letter grade perspective, right? So if they started with a D, they could get a B. If they started with a C, they could get an A, just from teaching them how to study the language. And finally, I do a lot of repetition. I remember my first course in Spanish, we went from the simple present tense to the subjunctive in what felt like a month. It's too much. It's too much. We have to repeat more, you know? Language acquisition comes from repetition, from learning how to understand something by getting exposed to a lot of comprehensible input, and then by trying to speak what we're hearing, right? To engage in a conversation. I think it's a whole lot better to focus on a few different scenarios that are highly relevant to someone's day-to-day interactions, like learning how to introduce yourself, talking like, what do you do when you first meet somebody? You introduce yourself, talk about where you're from, talk about what you like to do for fun, talk about what you like to do for work. So it's okay to drag that out for an extended period of time. I focus exclusively on that for the first month that I work with my students. We don't go into the past tense We don't even go into the nosotros form, right? We're just in tú y yo to cover all those daily interactions with people, right? It's very repetitive, but that's what makes it stick. That's what gets people able to effectively acquire the language very quickly. So if you haven't done it yet, make sure that you create your student profile, right? Keep in mind, the reason why you're doing this is because you want to motivate your students, you want to build their confidence, and you want to reduce their anxiety. So the better you know your student, what their nationality is, what their first language is, what their educational background is, how old they are, their experience with the language, their reasons for learning, and their current level, the more you are going to be able to do all three of those things. All right, so wrapping things up here, the last point we're going to talk about is where will you teach conversational Spanish or English or French or whatever language it is that you're teaching. So you've got the traditional places, right? K through 12 programs, higher education programs, nonprofits, there's adult educations, there's private schools, and then you can also just go out on your own like I did and start your own program. Let's go back to BVP. Traditional schools are typically resistant to conversation classes. So if you are a traditional K-12 teacher or higher, college professor or something like that, not to say that it's impossible, but it's very hard. So you have to prepare yourself to kind of handle the objections that administration might have when it comes to teaching conversation classes. First and foremost, big organizations are very resistant to any kind of change, right? So if you're trying to change the way languages are taught at your current school, good luck. It's not impossible. It is hard. It is challenging. So keep trying. That's all I can say there. BVP talks in this is a separate webinar about a lack of expertise in second language acquisition. So we've got language experts, and then we've got linguistics experts, right? So a language expert would be your traditional Spanish teacher that perhaps has a master's or a PhD in the language that can explain to you all of the grammar rules front and backwards, no problem, and teaches that way. But they don't necessarily understand the process that happens in the brain when somebody is learning how to communicate in the new language, right? So they're not experts in language acquisition. They're experts in the subject. And he's published several papers on this. He talks about surveys that he does in this webinar. So it's a fantastic webinar to watch. He also talks a lot about the top-down grad school requirements that influence the majors, which then influence the high schools, which is something that I talked about a little bit earlier. A lot of teachers don't know how to grade conversation, right? You can grade a multiple choice test very easily. And if you have 30 students in a classroom, what's the best way to test them, right? So you as the teacher aren't going to spend thousands of hours on the weekend going over tests. Give them a test that's easy to grade, right? However, those multiple choice tests are not helping you grade their conversational capabilities. So this is a challenge you have to think about, because your admin's going to ask you, okay, so how are you going to grade your students? How are you going to prove that they're learning how to speak the language? I've got a big secret. They're going to be speaking the language. you actually don't have to grade them. they're either going to speak the language or they're not. There's no need to grade it, right? My argument would be a pass-fail system, right? It's actually very simple. Anyways, the other thing he talks about a lot is the influence that the major publishers have on programs. So textbook publishers are in cahoots with higher education, which means they hire people to produce textbooks that cater towards that graduate school requirement. And it's a very complex system, right? Your customer per se is the student, but the student has no voice in what they're actually learning, and therefore the materials get produced for the grad school professor, which then gets pushed down to the undergrad professor, which then gets pushed down to the high school and middle school and elementary professors, which then gets pushed down to the students. So how students learn and what they want to learn actually has nothing to do with the process of creating materials for them to learn. So that's why we're in the situation that we're in today. But that's why also we need to be aware of these things as language instructors so that we can start teaching conversational classes to give our students what they want, which is to learn how to speak the new language. I started my own program in Denver about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. I started a school where I rented a physical place, and I grew that business to where I had 15 teachers working for me and about 300 students right before the pandemic hit. The pandemic hit, I flipped over to teaching all online, and now I am just teaching out of my living room. I can teach in person again, which is great, but here's a picture of me in my living room, right, with a couple of my students. I was nervous about doing this at first, I figured nobody would take it seriously because, if you don't go to a school, right, it seems like it would take away from the credibility. But I have no shortage of students. I get over 100 phone calls a week and I can't even answer my phone. So I've created a program that works and I've got a good reputation based off of that. So I think, the most important things about where you will teach is that it should be a quiet place. It should have good access to the internet and a large screen for presentations. Good luck getting a conversation program in place in our traditional program. I think you'll have a lot better luck just creating your own program. But yeah, we just need to keep working on this together. Other places you can give classes, if you want to start your own program, but you don't want to do it at your house, you can meet at rec centers or libraries or coffee shops even, right? Think about community gathering places where you can meet with your students and teaching them. If you are interested in creating a more formal program and renting an office space, I might suggest that you start by looking for co-working spaces. These are kind of cool things that have started popping up. I think a lot of people have heard of this company called WeWork, where you can just go rent an office by the hour, so you don't have to be 100% committed to an office. So I would say those are nice because they're quiet, they have good access to the internet, and you can set it up the way you want to while you're there. Leasing an office is another thing. I did it for years. It causes you to be 100% committed. It creates a lot of overhead, which will drive the prices up for your students. So that's something that you should think about before you take the plunge and lease an office for starting your own conversational Spanish or English program. All right, that's it for today. Does anybody have any questions for me? Feel free to ask your questions or chime in. These are the resources that I use to put together today's presentation. We talked about some of Bill VanPatten's webinars, Stephen Krashen's books, the webinar from Chris Lunsdale, which had a huge impact on me and the way I teach, and Steven Pinker's book. So these are all included in the resources for today's webinar. I'd love to hear your feedback. My idea is to do these at least once a month, maybe every other week, maybe once a week, depending on what people want. But I obviously want to make sure that we're talking about what you want to talk about, not just what I think is important. So feel free to put in the comments here if there's something you're particularly interested in. I've got a huge list of ideas that I think we could talk about. Anyways, while you're thinking that over, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate your participation and your time. I know it's hard sometimes to carve out a big chunk of time like this. Stay posted for the next webinar. Feel free to send me an email at david@thelanguageschool.us. Once again, my email is david@thelanguageschool.us. Or you could just, I'm sure you got the email reminder for this. So feel free just to reply to that email reminder. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. And hopefully I'll be seeing you in the next couple of weeks. Ciao.